We are here for, also I know that this live said that we were supposed to read 22 through 25, but obviously we already read those yesterday, and we also read 26 through 30, so we're starting on chapter 31 for people that don't know. For people that weren't at yesterday's live, I just didn't want to reschedule a new one, so I just left the one that I had up for today. So yeah, we are on chapter 31. Shit went down. It was very emotional, and yeah, so it wasn't fun. I didn't have fun yesterday. So, and today I'm guessing I won't have fun because the last line of the chapter was, as Celaena fell atop him, a part of Chaol fell along with her. So it hasn't been fun. So yeah, chapter 31, we're gonna start, and I'll probably cry, but whatever. Dorian knew that Chaol had no choice, no other way out of the situation, as his friend carried Celaena out of that bloody chamber, into the servants' stairwell, and down, 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 until they reached the castle dungeons. Okay, he's locking her in a dungeon? He tried not to look at Kaltain's curious, half-mad face as Chaol laid Celaena in the cell beside hers, as he locked the cell door. "Let me give her my cloak," Dorian said, reaching to unfasten it. "Don't," Chaol said quietly. His face was still bleeding. She'd gouged 4 lines across his cheek with her nails. Her nails. Gods above. "I don't trust her with anything in there except hay." Chaol had already taken the time to remove her remaining weapons, including 6 lethal-looking hairpins from her braid, and checked her boots and tunic for any hidden ones. Kaltain was smiling faintly at Celaena. "Don't touch her, don't talk to her, and don't look at her," Chaol said, as if there wasn't a wall of bars separating the 2 women. Kaltain just huffed and curled up on her side. Chaol barked orders to the guards about food and water rations and how often the watch was to be changed, and then stalked from the dungeon. Dorian silently followed. He didn't know where to begin. There was grief sweeping down on him in waves as he realized again and again that Nehemiah was dead. There was the sickness and terror of what he'd seen in that bedroom, and there was the horror and relief that he'd somehow used his power to stop Celaena's hand before she stabbed Chaol, and that no one except Celaena had noticed. And when she'd hissed at him, he'd seen something so savage in her eyes that he shuddered. They were halfway up the winding stone stairs out of the dungeons when Chaol suddenly slumped onto a step, putting his head in his hands. "What have I done?" Chaol whispered. And despite whatever was changing between them, he couldn't walk away from Chaol. Not tonight. Not when he too needed someone to sit next to. "Tell me what happened," Dorian said quietly, taking a seat on the stair beside him and staring into the gloom of the stairwell. So Chaol did. Dorian listened to his tale of kidnapping, of some rebel group trying to use him to get Celaena to trust them, of Celaena breaking into the warehouse and cutting down men like they were nothing, how the king had told Chaol of an anonymous threat to Nehemiah a week ago and ordered him to keep an eye on Nehemiah, how the king wanted the princess questioned and told Chaol to keep Celaena away tonight. And then Archer, the man she'd been dispatched to kill weeks ago, explaining that it had been code for Nehemiah being assassinated. And then how Celaena ran from the slums all the way back here to find that she'd been too late to save her friend. There were things Chaol still wasn't telling him, but Dorian understood it well enough. His friend was trembling, which was a horror in itself, another foundation slipping out from beneath their feet. "I've never seen anyone move like she did," Chaol breathed. "I've never seen anyone run that fast. Dorian, it was like..." Chaol shook his head. "I found a horse within seconds of her taking off, and she still outran me. Who can do that?" Dorian might have dismissed it as a warped sense of time due to fear and grief, but he'd had magic coursing through his veins only moments ago. "I didn't know this would happen," Chaol said, resting his forehead against his knees. "If your father wasn't my father," Dorian said. "I dined with my parents tonight." He'd just come from that dinner when Celaena went flying past, hell burning in her eyes. That look had been enough for him to run after her, guards in tow, until Chaol nearly collided with them in the halls. "My father said he was going to talk to Nehemiah later on, after dinner. From what I saw, this happened hours before that." "But if your father didn't want her dead, who did?" I had extra patrols on alert for any threat. I picked those men myself. Whoever did this got through them like they were nothing. Whoever did this... Dorian tried not to think of the murder scene. One of Cale's guards had taken a look at the 3 bodies and vomited all over the floor, and Selena had just stood there, staring at Nehemiah as if she'd been sucked out of herself. Whoever did this got some kind of sick delight out of it, Cale finished. The bodies flashed through Dorian's mind again, carefully, artfully arranged. What does it mean, though? It was easier to keep talking than to really consider what had happened. The way Selena had looked at him without really seeing him. The way she'd wiped away his tears with a finger, then grazed her nails across his neck, as though she could sense the pulsing life's blood beneath. And when she'd launched herself at Cale. How long will you keep her here? Dorian said, looking down the stairs. She had attacked the captain of the guard in front of his men. Worse than attacked. As long as it takes, Cale said quietly. For what? For her to decide not to kill us all. Selena knew where she was before she awoke, and she didn't care. She was living the same story again and again. The night she'd been captured, she'd also snapped and come so close to killing the person she most wanted to destroy before someone knocked her out and she awoke in a rotting dungeon. She smiled bitterly as she opened her eyes. It was always the same story, the same loss. A plate of bread and soft cheese along with an iron cup of water lay on the floor on the other side of the cell. Selena sat up, her head throbbing, and felt the bump on the side of her skull. I always knew you'd wind up here, Caltaine said from the cell beside hers. Did their Royal Highnesses tire of you too? Selena pulled the tray closer, then leaned against the stone wall behind the pallet of hay. I tired of them, she said. Did you kill anyone particularly deserving? Selena snorted, closing her eyes against the pounding in her mind. Almost. She could feel the stickiness of the blood on her hands and beneath her nails. Cale's blood. She hoped the 4 scratches scarred. She hoped she would never see him again. If she did, she'd kill him. He'd known the king wanted to question Nehemiah. He'd known that the king, the most brutal and murderous monster in the world, had wanted to question her friend. And he hadn't told her, hadn't warned her. It wasn't the king, though. No. She had gathered enough in the few minutes she'd been in the bedroom to know this wasn't his handiwork. But Cale had still been warned about the anonymous threat, had been aware that someone wanted to hurt Nehemiah, and he hadn't told her. She was so stupidly honorable and loyal to the king, or he was so stupidly honorable and loyal to the king that he didn't even think that she could have done something to prevent this. So she had nothing left to give. After she'd lost Sam and been sent to Endivere, she'd pieced herself back together in the bleakness of the mines. And when she'd come here, she'd been foolish enough to think that Cale had put the final piece into place. Foolish enough to think, just for a moment, that she could get away with being happy. But death was her curse and her gift. And death had been her good friend these long, long years. They killed Nehemiah, she whispered into the dark, needing someone, anyone, to hear that the once bright soul had been extinguished. To know that Nehemiah had been here, on this earth, and she had been all that was good and brave and wonderful. Caltaine was silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, as if she were trading one piece of misery for another, Duke Parrington is going to Morath in 5 days, and I'm to go with him. The king told me I can either marry him or rot down here for the rest of my life. Selena turned her head, opening her eyes to find Caltaine sitting against the wall, grasping her knees. She was even dirtier and more haggard than she'd been a few weeks ago. She still clutched Selena's cloak around her. Selena said, You betrayed the Duke. Why would he want you for his wife? Caltaine laughed quietly. Who knows what games these people play and what ends they have in mind? She rubbed her dirty hands on her face. My headaches are worse, she mumbled. And those wings, they never stop. My dreams have been filled with shadows and wings, Nehemiah had said. Caltaine, too. What has one to do with the other? Selena demanded, the words sharp and hollow. Caltaine blinked, raising her brows as though she had no idea what she'd said. How long will they keep you here? She asked. For trying to kill the captain of the guard. Forever, perhaps. She wouldn't care. Let them execute her. Let them put an end to her, too. Nehemiah had been the hope of a kingdom, of many kingdoms. The court Nehemiah had dreamed of would never be. Ilwi would never be free. Selena would never get the chance to tell her that she was sorry for the things she'd said. All that would remain were the last words Nehemiah had spoken to her, the last thing her friend had thought of her. "You are nothing more than a coward." "If they let you out," Kaltain said, both of them staring into the bleakness and the blackness of their prisons, "make sure that they're punished someday. Every last one of them." Selena listened to her own breathing, felt Kale's blood under her nails, and the blood of all those men she'd hacked down, and the coldness of Nehemiah's room, where all that gore had soaked the bed. "They will be," Selena swore to the darkness. She said nothing. She had nothing left to give, except that. It would have been better if she'd stayed in Endivir, better to have died there. Her body didn't quite feel like hers when she pulled the tray of food toward her, the metal scraping against the old, damp stones. She wasn't even hungry. "They drugged the water with a sedative," Kaltain said as Selena reached for the iron cup. "That's what they do for me, too." "Good," Selena said, and drank the entire thing. 3 days passed, and every meal they brought her was drugged with that sedative. Selena stared into the abyss that now filled her dreams, both sleeping and awake. The forest on the other side was gone, and there was no stag. Only barren terrain all around, crumbling rocks and a vicious wind that whispered the words again and again. "You are nothing more than a coward." So Selena drank the drugged water every time they offered it, and let it sweep her away. This is sad. She drank the water about an hour ago, Rest said to Kale on the morning of the 4th day. Kale nodded. She was unconscious on the floor, her face gaunt. "Has she been eating?" "A bite or two. She hasn't tried to escape, and she hasn't said one word to us either." Kale unlocked the cell door, and Rest and the other guards tensed, but he couldn't bear another moment without seeing her. Kaltain was asleep next door and didn't stir as he strode across Selena's cell. He knelt by Selena. She reeked of old blood, and her clothes were stiff with it. His throat tightened. In the castle above it had been sheer pandemonium for the past several days. He had men combing the castle and city for Nehemiah's assassin. He had gone before the king multiple times already to try to explain what happened, how he'd gotten himself kidnapped, and how, even with extra men watching Nehemiah, someone had slipped past them all. He was stunned the king hadn't dismissed him, or worse. The worst part was the king seemed smug. He hadn't had to dirty his hands to get rid of a problem. His main annoyance was dealing with the uproar that was sure to happen in Ilwi. He hadn't spared one moment to mourn Nehemiah, or shown a flicker of remorse. It had taken a surprising amount of self-control for Kale not to throttle his own sovereign. But more than just his fate relied on his submission and good behavior. When Kale had explained Selena's situation to the king, he had barely looked surprised. He just said to get her in line and left it at that. Get her in line. Kale gently picked up Selena, trying not to grunt at the weight, and carried her out of the cell. He'd never forgive himself for throwing her in this rotting dungeon, even though he hadn't had a choice. He hadn't even let himself sleep in his own bed, the bed that still smelled like her. He'd laid down on it that first night and realized what she was lying on, and opted for his couch instead. The least he could do right now was to get her back to her own rooms. But he didn't know how to get her in line. He didn't know how to fix what had been broken, both inside of her and between them. His men flanked him as he brought her up to her rooms. Nehemiah's death hung around him, followed his every step. It had been days since he dared look in the mirror, even if it hadn't been the king who had ordered Nehemiah dead. If Kale had warned Selena about the unknown threat, at least she would have been looking out. If he'd warned Nehemiah, her men would have been on alert too. Sometimes the reality of his decision hit him so hard he couldn't breathe. And then there was this reality, the reality he held in his arms as Ress opened the door to her rooms. Philippa was already waiting, beckoning him to the bathing chamber. He hadn't even thought of that Selena might need to be cleaned up before getting into bed. He couldn't meet the servant's gaze as he walked into the bathing chamber because he knew the truth he'd find there. He'd realized it the moment Selena had turned to him in Nehemiah's bedroom. He had lost her, and she would never, in 1,000 lifetimes, let him in again. Y'all, I feel so bad for him. I know y'all don't like him, but I feel so bad for him. Stop. Chapter 32. Selena awoke in her own bed and knew there would be no more sedatives in her water. There would be no more breakfast conversations with Nehemiah, nor would there be any more lessons on the word marks. There would be no more friends like her. She knew without looking that someone had scrubbed her clean, blinking against the brightness of the sunlight in her room, her head instantly pounding after days in the darkness of the dungeon. She found Fleetfoot sleeping pressed against her. The dog lifted her head to lick Selena's arm a few times before going back to sleep, her nose nestled between Selena's elbow and torso. She wondered if Fleetfoot could sense the loss, too. She'd often wondered if Fleetfoot loved the princess more than her. You're nothing more than a coward. She couldn't blame Fleetfoot. Outside of this rotten, festering court and kingdom, the rest of the world had loved Nehemiah. It was hard not to. Selena had adored Nehemiah from the moment she'd laid eyes on her, like they were twin souls who had at last found each other. I'm gonna cry. A soul friend. And now she was gone. Selena put a hand against her chest. How absurd. How utterly absurd and useless that her heart still beat and Nehemiah's didn't. The eye of Elena was warm, as if trying to offer some comfort. Selena let her hand drop back to her mattress. She didn't even try to get out of bed that day, after Philippa coaxed her into eating and let slip that she'd missed Nehemiah's funeral. She'd been too busy guzzling down sedatives and hiding from her grief in the dungeons to be present when they put her friend in the cold earth, so far from the sun-warm soil of Ilwi. You were nothing more than a coward. So Selena didn't get out of bed that day, and she didn't get out of it the next, or the next, or the next. Chapter 33. This is so sad. This is so sad. What chapter are we reading to today, friends? These chapters are pretty short. Oh no, never mind. Oh no, they're pretty short. We can go to like 35. The mines in Kalikula were stifling, and the slave girl could only imagine how much worse they would become when the summer sun was overhead. Who is this? Through 36? Oh, okay. Who is this? She had been in the mines for 6 months, longer than anyone else had ever survived, she'd been told. Her mother, her grandmother, and her little brother hadn't lasted a month. Her father hadn't even made it to the mines before Ardalan's butchers had cut him down, along with the other known rebels in their village. Everyone else had been rounded up and sent here. She'd been alone for 5.5 months now. Alone, yet surrounded by thousands. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen the sky, or the grasslands of Ilwi undulating in a cool breeze. She would see them both again, though. The sky and the grasslands. She knew she would, because she'd stayed awake on nights she was supposed to have been sleeping, listening through the cracks in the floorboards as her father and his fellow rebels talked of ways to bring down Ardalan, of Princess. And of Princess Nehemiah, who was in the capital at that very moment, working for their freedom. If she could just hold on, if she could just keep drawing breath, she might make it until Nehemiah... Yo! Make it until Nehemiah accomplished her goal. She would make it and then bury her dead. And when the mourning months were over, she would find the nearest rebel group and join them. With every Ardalanian life she took, she would say the names of her dead again, so that they would hear her in the afterlife and know they were not forgotten. She swung her pickaxe into the unforgiving wall of stone, her breath ragged in her parched throat. The overseer lounged again against a nearby wall, sloshing water in his canteen, waiting for the moment when one of them would collapse just so he could unfurl that whip of his. She kept her head down, kept working, kept breathing. She would make it. She didn't know how much time passed, but she felt the ripple go through the mines like a shudder in the earth, a ripple of stillness, followed by wails. She felt it coming, swelling up toward her, closer and closer with each turned head and murmured words. And then she heard it, the words that changed everything. Princess Nehemiah is dead, assassinated by Ardalan. The words were past her before she had time to swallow them. There was a scrape of leather against rock. The overseer was tolerant The overseer would tolerate the pause for only a few seconds longer before he started swinging. Nehemiah is dead. She stared down at the pickaxe in her hands. She turned, slowly, to look into the face of her overseer, the face of Ardalan. He cocked his wrist, pronged whip ready. She felt her tears before she realized they were falling, sliding through 6 months' worth of filth. Enough. The words screamed through her, so loudly she began to shake. Silently, she began to recite the names of her dead, and as the overseer raised his whip, she added her name to the end of that list and swung her axe into his gut. Y'all. Oh my god. This is so sad. This is so sad. I'm gonna start crying. We're reading Crown of Midnight. It's the technically second, but the third one for me, book in the Throne of Glass series. Chapter 34. Any changes in her behavior? She got out of bed. And, standing in the sunlit hall of the upper levels of the glass castle, Ress's usually jovial face was grim. And now she's sitting in a chair in front of the fire. It's the same as yesterday. She got out of bed, sat in the chair all day, then got back into bed at sundown. Is she still not speaking? Ress shook his head, keeping his voice low as a courtier passed by. Philippa says she just sits there and stares at the fire. Won't speak. She barely touches her food. Ress's eyes grew warier as they took in the healing cuts that ran down Cale's cheeks. 2 had already scabbed and would fade, but there was a long, surprisingly deep one that was still tender. Cale wondered whether it would scar. He'd deserve it if it did. Yaw! I'm probably overstepping my bounds. Then don't say it, Cale growled. He knew exactly what Ress would say. The same thing Philippa said, and anyone who saw him and gave him that pitying glance. You should try talking to her. He didn't know how word had gotten out so quickly that she'd tried to kill him, but it seemed they all knew how deep the break between him and Selena went. He'd thought the 2 of them had been discreet, and he knew Philippa wasn't a gossip, but perhaps what he felt for her had been written all over him, and what she now felt for him. He resisted the urge to touch the cuts on his face. I still want the watch posted outside her doors and windows, he ordered. He ordered Ress. He was on his way to another meeting, another shouting match, about how they should deal with the fallout in Ilwi over the princess's death. Don't stop her if she leaves, but try to slow her down a bit. Long enough for word to get to him that she'd finally left her rooms. If anyone was going to intercept Selena, if anyone would confront her about what had happened to Nehemiah, it would be him. Until then, he'd give her the space she needed, even if it killed him not to speak to her. She'd become entwined in his life, from the morning runs to the lunches to the kisses she stole from him when no one was looking. And now, without her, he felt hollow. But he still didn't know how he'd ever look her in the eye. You will always be my enemy. She'd meant it. Ress nodded, consider it done. The young guard saluted as Cale headed for the meeting room. There would be other meetings today. Lots of meetings, since the debate was still raging over how Ardalan should react to Nehemiah's death, and though he hated to admit it, he had other things to worry about than Selena's unending grief. The king had summoned his southern lords and retainers to Rifthold, including Cale's father. Dorian usually didn't mind Cale's men, but he did mind being followed around day and night by guards who were on the lookout for any threat. Nehemiah's death had proved that the castle was not impenetrable. Sorry, that's not what that says. Impregnable? Bitch, I don't know. Anyway, his mother and Holland were sequestered in her chambers, and many of the nobility had either left the city or were lying low too, except Roland. Though Roland's mother had fled back to Mia the morning after the princess was assassinated, Roland stayed, insisting that Dorian would need his support now more than ever. And he was right. At the council meetings, which grew more and more crowded as the southern lords arrived, Roland backed every point and objection that Dorian made. Together they argued against sending more troops into Ilwi in case of a revolt, and Roland seconded Dorian's proposal that they should publicly apologize to Nehemiah's parents for her death. His father had exploded when Dorian suggested that, but Dorian had still written her parents a message expressing his deepest condolences. His father would could go to hell for all he cared. And that was starting to be a problem, he realized, as he sat in his tower room and flipped through all the documents he had to read before tomorrow's meeting with the Southern Lords. He had spent so long being careful to avoid defying his father, and what sort of man could he call himself if he blindly obeyed? A smart man, part of him whispered, flickering with that cold, ancient power. At least his 4 guards stayed outside his rooms. His private tower was high enough that no one could reach the balcony, and only one stair led up and down, easily defensible. But it also made for an easy cage. Dorian stared at the glass pen on his desk. The night Nehemiah had died, he hadn't intended to stop Selena's wrist in midair. He'd just known that the woman he loved was about to kill his oldest friend over a misunderstanding. He'd been too far away to grab her as she plunged the blade down, but then it was like a phantom arm reached out from within him and wrapped around her wrist. He could feel her blood-crusted skin, as if he himself were touching her. But he hadn't known what he was doing. He'd just acted on gut feeling and desperation and need. He had to learn to control this power, whatever it was. If he could control it, then he could keep it from appearing at inopportune times, like when he was in those damned council meetings and his temper rose, and he felt the magic stirring in response. Dorian took a deep breath, focusing on the pen, willing it to move. He'd stopped Selena mid-strike. He'd thrown a wall of books into the air. He could move a pen. It didn't move. After staring at it until his eyes nearly crossed, Dorian groaned and leaned back in his chair, covering his eyes with his hand. Maybe he'd gone insane. Maybe he just imagined the whole thing. Nehemiah had once promised to be there when he needed help. When some power in him awoke, she had known. Had her assassin, in killing Nehemiah, also killed any hope he had of finding answers? Selena had only started sitting in the chair because Philippa had come in yesterday and complained about the dirty sheets. She might have told Philippa to go to hell, but then she considered who had last shared this bed with her, and was suddenly glad to have them replaced. Any trace of him she wanted gone. As the sun finished setting, she sat before the fire, staring into the glowing embers that grew brighter as the world darkened. Time was shifting and ebbing around her. Some days had passed in an hour, others a lifetime. She had bathed once, long enough to wash her hair, and Philippa had watched the whole time to make sure she didn't drown herself instead. Selena ran a thumb over the armrest of the chair. She had no intention of ending her life, not before she did what needed to be done. The shadows in the room grew, and the embers seemed to breathe as she watched them, breathing with her, pulsing with each heartbeat. In these days of silence and sleep, she'd realized one thing. The assassin had come from outside the palace. Perhaps they had been hired by whoever had initially threatened Nehemiah's life. Perhaps not. But they weren't associated with the king. Selena gripped the arms of the chair, and her nails digging into the polished wood. It hadn't been one of Arobyn's assassins, either. She knew his style, and it wasn't this monstrous. She again went over the details of the bedroom, now branded into her mind. She did know one killer this monstrous. Grave. She'd learned as much about him as she could when she'd faced him in the competition to become King's champion. She'd heard what he did to the bodies of his victims. Her lips pulled back from her teeth. Grave knew the palace. He trained here just as she had, and he'd known, too, just whom he was murdering and dismembering, and what it would mean to her. A familiar, dark fire rippled in her gut, spreading through her, dragging her down into an abyss without end. Selena Sardossian stood from her chair. I'm not bored! Chapter 35. There would be no candles for these midnight deeds, no ivory horn to signal the start of this hunt. She dressed in her darkest tunic and slid a smooth black mask into her cloak pocket. All of her weapons, even the hairpins, had been removed from her rooms. She knew without checking that the doors and windows were being watched. Good. This was not the sort of hunt that began at the front door. Selena locked her bedroom and spared a glance at Fleetfoot, who cowered under the bed as she hauled open the secret door. The dog was still quietly whining as Selena strode into the passage. She didn't need a light to make her way down the tomb. She knew the path by memory now, each step, each turn. Her cloak whispered against the steps. Down and down she went. It was war upon them all. Let them tremble in fear at what they had awoken. Moonlight spilled into the landing, illuminating the open door of the tomb in Mort's little bronze face. "I'm sorry about your friend," he said with surprising sorrow as she stalked toward him. She didn't reply, and she didn't care how he knew. She just kept walking, through the door and between the sarcophagi to the heap of treasure piled in the back. Daggers, hunting knives. She took whatever she could strap onto her belt or tuck into her boots. She took a handful of gold and jewels and shoved that into a pocket, too. "What are you doing?" Mort demanded from the hallway. Selena approached the stand that displayed Damaris, sword of Gavin, first king of Ardalan. The hollowed-out golden pommel glinted in the moonlight as she pulled the scabbard from the stand and strapped it across her back. "That is a sacred sword," Mort hissed, as though he could see inside. Selena smiled grimly as she stalked back to the door, flinging her hood over her head. "Wherever you're going," Mort went on, "whatever you plan to do, you debase that sword by taking it from here. Aren't you afraid of angering the gods?" Selena just laughed quietly before she took the stairs, savoring each step, each movement that brought her closer to her prey. I feel like this isn't gonna end well for her. What's going on? Hold on. Okay. Sorry. She relished the burn in her arms as she hauled the sewer grate up, rotating the ancient wheel until it was fully raised, dripping with filth, and the water beneath the castle flowed freely into the small river outside. She tossed a piece of broken stone into the river beyond the archway, listening for guards. Not a sound, not a scrape of armor or a whisper of warning. An assassin had killed Nehemiah, an assassin with a taste for the grotesque and a desire for notoriety. Finding Grave would take only a few questions. She tried the chain around the lever, testing its strength and checked to ensure that Damaris was tightly strapped to her back. Then, gripping the castle stones, she swung around the wall, slithering sideways. She didn't bother to glance up at the castle as she eased around the bank of the river, dropped onto the frozen ground. Then she vanished into the night. Cloaked in darkness, Selena stalked through the streets of Rifthold. She made no sound as she passed through dim alleys. Only one place could provide the answers she wanted. Sewage and puddles of excrement lay beneath every window of the slums, and the cobblestone streets were cracked and misshapen after many hard winters. The buildings leaned against each other, some so ramshackle that even the poorest citizens had abandoned them. On most streets, the taverns overflowed with drunks and whores and everyone else who sought temporary relief from their miserable lives. It made no difference how many saw her. None would bother her tonight. The cape billowed behind her, her face remaining expressionless beneath her obsidian mask as she moved through the streets, the vaults just a few blocks away. Selena's gloved hands clenched. Once she found out where Grave was hiding, she turned his skin inside out. Worse than that, actually. She stopped before a nondescript iron door in a quiet alley. Hired thugs stood watch outside. She flashed them the silver entrance fee, and they opened the door for her. In the subterranean warren below, one could find the cutthroats, the monsters, and the damned of Ardalan. The filth came here to exchange stories and make deals, and it was here that any whisper of Nehemiah's assassin would be found. Grave had undoubtedly received a large fee for his services and could be counted on to now be recklessly spending his blood money, a spree that would not go unnoticed. He wouldn't have left Rifthold. Oh no. He wanted people to know he killed the princess. He wanted to hear himself named the new Ardalan's assassin. He wanted Selena to know too. As she headed down the steps into the vaults, the reek of ale and unwashed bodies hit her like a stone to the face. She hadn't been in this sort of festering den for a long while. The main chamber was strategically lit. Sorry, y'all. Hold on, I need to drink water. I'm stuttering all over the place. Oop. A chandelier hung in the center of the room, but there was little light to be found along the walls for those who sought not to be seen. All laughter halted as she strode between the tables. Red-rimmed eyes followed her every step. She didn't know the identity of the new crime lord who ruled over this place, and didn't care. Her business wasn't with him, not tonight. She didn't allow herself to look at the many fighting pits that occupied the distant end of the chamber, pits where crowds were still gathered, cheering for whoever fought with fists and feet within. She'd been to the vaults before, many times in those final days before her capture. Now that Ion Jane and Rorik Farron were dead, the place seemed to have passed into new ownership without losing any of its depravity. Selena walked right up to the barkeep. He didn't recognize her, but she didn't expect him to, not when she'd been so careful to hide her identity all those years. The barkeep was already pale, and his sparse hair had become even sparser over the past year and a half. He tried to peer beneath her cowl as she halted at the bar, but the mask and hood kept her features hidden. "Drink?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Everyone in the bar was still watching her, either discreetly or outright. "No," she said, her voice contorted and deep beneath the mask. The barkeep gripped the edge of the counter. You're back," he said quietly, as more heads turned. "You escaped." So he did recognize her then. She wondered if the new owners held a grudge against her for killing Ion Jane, and how many bodies she'd have to leave in her wake if they decided to start a fight right here, right now. What she planned to do tonight already broke enough rules, crossed too many lines. She leaned on the bar, crossing one ankle over the other. The barkeep mopped his brow again and poured her a brandy. "On the house," he said, sliding it to her. She caught it in her hand, but didn't drink it. He wet his lips, then asked, How did you escape?" People leaned back in their chairs, straining to hear. Let them spread rumors. Let them hesitate before crossing her path. She hoped Arabin heard too. She hoped he heard and stayed the hell away from her. "You'll soon discover that," she said. "But I have need of you." His brows lifted. "Me?" "I've come to inquire after a man." Her voice was scratchy and hollow. "A man who recently earned a large sum of gold for the assassination of the Ilwi princess. He goes by the name of Grave. I need to know where he is." "I don't know anything." The barkeep's face turned even paler. She reached into a pocket and pulled out a glittering fistful of ancient jewels and gold. All eyes watched them now. "Allow me to repeat my question, barkeep." I don't know if B is putting two and two together. What do you mean? What do you mean? Putting two and two together with... Wait, what? Am I supposed to be paying attention to something? Hold on. Putting two and two together? Oh, yeah, I knew that. I knew that. But I chose to ignore it because I thought she was going to mention him when she said that people were fighting in the pits, but I chose to ignore it so that I wouldn't start crying. The assassin who called himself Grave ran. Oh shit. She already caught up to him? He didn't know how long she'd been hunting him. It had been well over a week since he'd killed the princess. A week, and no one had even looked his way. He thought he'd gotten away with it, and had even started wondering whether he should have been more creative with the body, creative with the body, if he should have left some sort of calling card behind. But all that had changed tonight. He'd been drinking at the counter of his favorite tavern when the packed room had suddenly gone quiet. He turned to see her in the doorway as she called out his name, looking more wraith than human. His name hadn't even finished echoing in the room before he burst into a sprint, escaping through the back exit and into the alley. He couldn't hear footsteps, but he knew she was behind him, melting in and out of shadows and mist. He took alleys and side streets, leaping over walls, zigzagging across the slums, anything to shake her, to wear her down. He'd make his final stand in a quiet street. There, he would take out the blades strapped to his skin and make her pay for the way she'd humiliated him in the competition. That's funny. The way she had sneered at him, the way she'd broken his nose and tossed her handkerchief onto his chest. Haughty, stupid bitch. He staggered as he rounded a corner, his breath ragged and raw. He had only 3 daggers hidden on him. He'd make them count, though. When she'd appeared at the tavern, he had immediately taken note of the broadsword hovering over one of her shoulders and the assortment of gleaming, wicked-looking blades strapped to her hips. But he could make her pay, even if he only had a few blades. Grave was halfway down the cobblestone alley when he realized it was a dead end, the far wall too high to climb. here then. He'd soon have her begging for mercy before he cut in. Is this man for real? Is this man for real? Oh my god. He'd soon have her begging for mercy before he cut her into little pieces. Right. Drawing one of his daggers, he smiled and turned to the open street behind him. Blue mist drifted in, and a rat scurried across the narrow passage. Oh, bitch. Oh, she's getting cinematic. Almost said cinematic. She's getting cinematic about it. Oh, we're buffering? Wait, but it says I'm good. She's like Mike Myers. Do not compare Selena to Michael Myers. I don't know if y'all know the personal beef I have with that man, but he horrifies me. I don't want to compare Selena to him. I actually don't know why. There it goes. There was no noise, only the sounds of distant revelry. Perhaps he had lost her. Those royal fools had made the biggest mistake of their lives when they crowned her champion. Right. His client had said as much when he'd hired Grave. He waited a moment, still watching the open street entrance, and then allowed himself to breathe, surprised to find that he was a little disappointed. King's champion indeed. It hadn't been hard to lose her at all, and now he would go home and he'd receive another job offer in a matter of days, and then another, and another. His client had promised him that the offers would come. Arabin Hamel would curse, sorry, I thought my phone was dying. Arabin Hamel would curse the day he had rejected Grave from the Assassin's Guild for being too cruel with his prey. Grave chuckled, flipping his dagger in his hands. Then she appeared. She came through the fog, no more than a sliver of darkness. She didn't run. She just walked with that insufferable swagger. Grave surveyed the building surrounding them. The stone was too slippery, and there were no windows. One step at a time she approached. He would really enjoy making her suffer as much as the princess had. Smiling, Grave retreated to the end of the alley, only stopping when his back hit the stone wall. In a narrower space, he could overpower her, and in this forgotten street, he could take his own sweet time doing what he wanted. Still she approached, and the sword at her back whined as she drew it. The moonlight glinted off the long blade, probably a gift from her princeling lover. Grave pulled his second dagger from his boot. This wasn't a frilly, ridiculous competition run by nobility. Here, any rules applied. She didn't say anything when she neared, and Grave didn't say anything to her as he rushed at her, swiping for her head with both blades. She stepped aside, dodging him with maddening ease. Grave lunged again, but faster than he could follow as she ducked and slashed her swords across his shins. He hit the wet ground before he felt the pain. The world flashed black and gray and red, and agony tore at him. A dagger still left in his hand, he scuttled backward toward the wall, but his legs wouldn't respond, and his arms strained to pull him through the damp filth. "Bitch," he hissed. "Bitch." He hit the wall, blood pouring from his legs. Bone had been sliced. He would not be able to walk. He could still find a way to make her pay, though. She stopped a few feet away and sheathed her sword. She drew a long, jeweled dagger. He swore at her, the filthiest word he could think of. "I'm guessing it's the C word." She chuckled, and faster than a striking asp, she had one of his arms against the wall, the dagger glinting. Pain ripped through his right wrist, then his left as it, too, was slammed into the stone. Grave screamed, truly screamed, as he found his arms pinned to the wall by two daggers. His blood was nearly black in the moonlight. He thrashed, cursing her again and again. He would bleed to death unless he pulled his arms from the wall. With otherworldly silence, she crouched before him and lifted his chin with another dagger. Grave panted as she brought her face close to his. There was nothing beneath the cowl, nothing of this world. She had no face. "Who hired you?" she asked, her voice like gravel. "To do what?" he asked, almost sobbing. Maybe he could feign innocence. He could talk his way out, convince this arrogant whore he had nothing to do with it. She turned the dagger, pressing it into his neck. "To kill Princess Nehemiah." "No one. I don't know what you're talking about." And then, without even an intake of breath, she buried another dagger he hadn't realized she'd been holding into his thigh. so deep he felt the reverberation as it hit the cobblestones beneath. His scream shattered out of him, and Grave writhed, his wrists rising farther on the blades. "Who hired you?" she asked again, calm, so calm. "Gold," Grave moaned. "I've gold." She drew yet another dagger and shoved it into his other thigh, piercing again to the stone. Grave shrieked to the gods who did not save him. "Who hired you?" "I don't know what you're talking about." After a heartbeat, she withdrew the daggers from his thighs. He almost soiled himself at the pain, at the relief. "Thank you," he wept. Even as he thought of how he would punish her, she sat back on her heels and stared at him. "Thank you." But then she brought up another dagger, its edge serrated and glinting, and hovered it close to his hand. "Pick a finger," she said. He trembled and shook his head. "Pick a finger. Please." A wet warmth filled the seat of his pants. "Oh, I like this. I like this." "Thumb it is." "No, I'll tell you everything." Still, she brought the blade closer until it rested against the base of his thumb. "Don't. I'll tell you everything." Damn. Damn! I love her. I love her. Chapter 36. Dorian just started to feel his temper fray after hours of debate when the doors to his father's council room were thrown open and Celaena prowled in, her dark cape billowing behind her. All 20 men at the table fell silent, including his father, whose eyes went straight to the thing dangling from Celaena's hand. Cale was already striding across the room from his post by the door, but he too stopped when he beheld the object she carried. A head. Oh, this bitch is getting bold with it. The man's face was still set in a scream, and there was something vaguely familiar about the grotesque features and mousy brown hair that she gripped. It was hard to be certain as it swung from her gloved fingers. Cale put a hand on his sword, his face pale as death. The other guards in the room drew their blades but wouldn't move until Cale or the king commanded them. "What is this?" the king demanded. The councilmen and assembled lords were gaping, but Celaena was smiling as her eyes locked onto one of the ministers at the table, and she walked right toward him. And no one, not even Dorian's father, said anything as she set the severed head atop the minister's sack of papers. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, releasing her grip on the hair. The head lolled to the side with a thud. Then she patted the minister's shoulder before rounding the table and plopping into an empty chair, at one end, sprawling across it. "Explain yourself," the king growled at her. She crossed her arms, smiling at the minister, whose face had turned green as he stared at the head before him. "I had a little chat with Grave about Princess Nehemiah last night," she said. "Grave, the assassin from the competition, and Minister Mollison's champion." "He sends his regards, Minister. He also sends this." She tossed something onto the long table, a small golden bracelet engraved with lotus blossoms, something Nehemiah would have worn. "Here's a lesson for you, Minister. From one professional to another. Cover your tracks, and hire assassins without personal connections to you. And perhaps try not to do it so soon after you've publicly argued with your target." Mollison was looking at the king with pleading eyes. "I didn't do this." He recoiled from the severed head. "I have no idea what she's talking about. I'd never do something like this." "It's not what Graves said," Celaena crooned. Dorian could only stare at her. This was different from the feral creature she'd become the night Nehemiah had died. What she was right now, the edge on which she was balancing. Word helped them all. But then Cale was at her chair, grasping her elbow. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" How is he going to have the audacity to touch her right now? To even breathe in her direction right now? Celaena looked up at him and smiled sweetly. "Your job, apparently." She shook off his grip with a thrash, then got out of her seat, stalking around the table. She pulled a piece of paper out of her tunic and tossed it in front of the king. The impertinence in that throw should have earned her a trip to the gallows, but the king said nothing. Following her around the table, a hand still on his sword, Cale watched her with a face like stone. Dorian began praying they wouldn't come to blows. Not here, not again. If it riled his magic and his father saw, Dorian wouldn't even think of that power when he was in a room with so many potential enemies. He was sitting beside the person who would give the order to have him put down. His father took the paper from where he sat. Dorian could see that it was a list of names, at least 15 long. "Before the unfortunate death of the princess," she said, "I took it upon myself to eliminate some traitors to the crown. My target," she said, and he knew his father was aware she meant Archer, "led me right to them." Dorian couldn't look at her for a moment longer. This couldn't be the whole truth. But she hadn't gone after them to hunt them down. She'd gone to save Kale. So why lie now? Why pretend she'd been hunting them? What sort of game was she playing? Dorian looked across the table. Minister Mollison was still trembling at the severed head in front of him. He wouldn't have been surprised if the minister vomited right there. He was the one who had made the anonymous threat to against Nehemiah's life. After a moment, his father looked up from the list and surveyed her. "Well done, champion. Well done indeed." Then Selena and the King of Ardalan smiled at each other, and it was the most terrifying thing Dorian had ever seen. Tell my extra care, I don't know how to say that, bitch. Anyway, to give you double last month's payments, the king said. Dorian felt his gorge rise, not just for the severed head and her blood-stiffened clothing, but also for the fact that he could not, for the life of him, find the girl he had loved anywhere in her face. And from Kale's expression, he knew his friend felt the same. Selena bowed dramatically to the king, flourishing a hand before her. Then, with a smile devoid of any warmth, she stared down Kale before stalking from the room, her dark cape sweeping behind her. Silence, and then Dorian's attention returned to Minister Mollison, who merely whispered, "Please," before the king ordered Kale to have him drive to the dungeons. Selena wasn't done, not nearly. Perhaps the bloodletting was over, but she still had another person to visit before she could return to her bedroom and wash off the stink of Graves' blood. Archer was resting when she arrived at his townhouse, and his butler didn't dare stop her as she strode up the carpeted front steps, stormed down the elegant wood-paneled hallway, and flung open the double doors to what could only have been his room. Archer jolted in bed, wincing as he put a hand to his bandaged shoulder. Then he took in her appearance, the dagger still strapped to her waist. He went very, very still. "I'm sorry," he said. She stood at the foot of his bed, staring down at him, at his wan face and injured shoulder. "You're sorry. Kale's sorry. The whole damn world is sorry. Tell me what you and your movement want. Tell me what you know about the king's plans." "I didn't want to lie to you," Archer said gently, "but I needed to know that I could trust you before I told you the truth. Nehemiah," she tried not to wince at the name, "said you could be trusted, but I needed to know for sure, and I needed you to trust me too." "So you thought kidnapping Kale would make me trust you?" "We kidnapped him because we thought he and the king were planning to hurt her. I needed you to come to that warehouse and hear from Westfall's lips that he was aware there had been threats to her safety, and he didn't tell you. To realize that he is the enemy. If I'd known you would go so berserk, I never would have done it." She shook her head. "That list you sent me yesterday, of the men from the warehouse, they're truly dead?" "You killed them, yes." Guilt punched through her. "For my part, I'm sorry." And she was. She'd memorized their names, tried to recall their faces. She would carry the weight of their deaths forever. Even Graves' death, what she'd done to him in that alley, she'd never forget that either. "I gave their names to the king. It should keep him from looking in your direction for a little while longer. 5 days at most." Archer nodded, sinking back into the pillows. "Nehemiah really worked with you?" It was why she came to Rifthold, to see what could be done about organizing a force in the north, to give us information directly from the castle, as Selena had always suspected. "Her loss," he closed his eyes. "We can't replace her." Selena swallowed. "But you could," Archer said, looking at her again. "I know you came from Terrasen, so part of you has to realize that Terrasen must be free. You are nothing more than a coward." She kept her face blank. "Be our eyes and ears in the castle," Archer whispered. "Help us. Help us, and we can find a way to save everyone. To save you." We don't know what the king plans to do, only that he somehow found a source of power outside magic, and that he's probably using that power to create monstrosities of his own. But to what end, we don't know. That's what Nehemiah was trying to discover, and it's knowledge that could save us all. She would digest all of that later, much later. For now, she stared at Archer, then looked down at her blood-stiffened clothing. I found the man who killed Nehemiah. Archer's eyes widened. And? She turned to walk out of the room. And the debt has been paid. Minister Mollison hired him to get rid of a thorn in his side, because she put him down one too many times in council meetings. The minister is now in the dungeons, awaiting his trial. And she would be there for every minute of that trial, and the execution afterward. Archer loosed a sigh as she put her hand on the doorknob. She looked over her shoulder at him, at the fear and sadness on his face. "You took an arrow for me," she said quietly, gazing at the bandages. "That was the least I could do after I caused that whole mess." She chewed on her lip and opened the door. We have 5 days until the king expects you to be dead. Prepare yourself and your allies." But nothing," she interrupted. "Consider yourself fortunate that I'm not going to rip out your throat for the stunt you pulled. Arrow or no arrow, and regardless of my relationship with Cale, you lied to me and kidnapped my friend. If it hadn't been for you, if it hadn't been for that, for you, I would have been at the castle that night." She fixed him with a stare. "I'm done with you. I don't want your information. I'm not going to give you information, and I don't particularly care what happens to you once you leave this city, as long as I never see you again." She took a step into the hallway. "Selena," she looked over her shoulder. "I'm sorry. I know how much she meant to her, and she to you." The weight she'd been avoiding since she'd gone to hunt graves suddenly fell on her, and her shoulders drooped. She was so tired. Now that Grave was dead, now that Minister Mollison was in the dungeon, now that she had no one left to maim and punish, she was so tired. 5 days. I'll be back in 5 days. If you aren't prepared to leave Rifthold, then I won't bother faking your death. I'll kill you before you know I'm in the room." Cale kept his face blank and his shoulders thrown back as his father surveyed him. "Oh, not the dad. Oh, I just popped my back." Woo! The small breakfast room in his father's suite was sunny and silent. Pleasant, even, but Cale remained at the doorway as he looked at his father for the first time in 10 years. The Lord of Anil looked almost the same, his hair a bit grayer, but his face still ruggedly handsome, far too similar to Cale's for his own liking. "The breakfast is growing cold," his father said, waving a broad hand to the table and empty chair across from him. His first words. Cale clenched his jaw so hard it hurt as he walked across the bright room and slid into the chair. His father poured himself a glass of juice and said, without looking at him, "At least you fill out your uniform. Thanks to your mother's blood, your brother is all gangly limbs and awkward angles." Cale bristled at the way his father spat "your mother's blood," but made himself pour a cup of tea, then butter a slice of bread. "Are you just going to keep quiet, or are you going to say something?" "What could I possibly have to say to you?" His father gave him a thin smile. "A polite son would inquire after the state of his family. I haven't been your son for 10 years. I don't see why I should start acting like one now." His father's eyes flicked to the sword at Cale's side, examining, judging, weighing. Cale reined in the urge to walk out. It had been a mistake to accept his father's invitation. He should have burned the note he received last night, but after he'd ensured that Minister Mollison was locked up the king's lecture about Selena making a fool out of him, and his guards had somehow worn through his better judgment. And Selena, he had no idea how she'd gotten out of her rooms. None. The guards had been alert and had reported no noise. The windows hadn't been opened, and neither had her front door. And when he asked Philippa, she only said that the bedroom door had been locked all night. Selena was keeping secrets again. She'd lied to the king about the men she'd killed in the warehouse to rescue him, and there were other mysteries lurking around her, mysteries that he'd better start figuring out if he was to stand a chance of surviving her wrath. What his men had reported about the body that had been found in that alley. "Tell me what you've been up to." "What do you wish to know?" Cale said flatly, not touching his food or drink. His father leaned back in his seat, a movement that had once made Cale start sweating. It usually meant that his father was about to focus all his attention on him, that he would judge and consider and dole out punishment for any weakness, any missteps. But Cale was a grown man now, and he answered only to his king. Are you enjoying the position you sacrificed your lineage to attain? Yes. I suppose I have you to thank for being dragged to Rifthold, and if Ilwi rises up, then I suppose we can all thank you as well. It took every ounce of will he had, but Cale just took a bite from his bread and stared at his father. Something like approval flickered in the man's eyes, and he took a bite of his own bread before he said, Do you have a woman at least? The effort it took to keep his face blank was considerable. No. His father smiled slowly. You're always a horrible liar. Cale looked toward the window, toward the cloudless day that was revealing the first hint of spring. For your sake, I hope she's at least of noble blood. For my sake? You might have spat on your lineage, but you're still a Westfall, and we do not marry scullery maids. Cale snorted, shaking his head. I marry whoever I please, whether she's a scullery maid or a princess or a slave, and it'll be none of your damn business. His father folded his hands in front of him. After a long silence, he said quietly, Your mother misses you. She wants you home. The breath was knocked out of him, but he kept his face blank, his tone steady as he said, And do you, father? His father stared right at him, through him. After a long silence, he said quietly, Oh, wait, hold on. If Ilwi rises up in retaliation, if we find ourselves facing a war, then Anil would need a strong heir. If you've groomed Terran to be your heir, then I'm sure he'll do just fine. Terran is a scholar, not a warrior. He was born that way. If Ilwi rebels, there's a good chance that the wild men and the Fangs will rise up too. I cannot make sense of that sentence. Sorry. Anil will be the first place they sack. They've been dreaming of revenge for too long. Cale wondered just how much this was grating on his father's pride, and part of him truly wanted to make him suffer for it. But he'd had enough of suffering and enough of hatred, and he hardly had any fight left in him now that Selena had made it clear she'd sooner eat hot coals than look at him with affection in her eyes. Now that Selena was gone. So he just said, My position is here. My life is here. Your people need you. They will need you. Would you be so selfish as to turn your back on them? The way my father turned his back on me? His father smiled again, a cruel, cold thing. You disgraced your family when you gave up your title. You disgraced me. But you have made yourself useful these years. May the Crown Prince rely upon you, and when Dorian is king, he'll reward you for it, won't he? He could make Anil a duchy and bless you with lands large enough to rival Parrington's territory around Morath. What is it that you really want, father? To protect your people, or to use my friendship with Dorian to your gain? Would you throw me in the dungeons if I said both? I hear you like to do that to the people who dare provoke you these days. And then there was a gleam in his eyes that told Cale just how much his father already knew. If perhaps you do, your woman and I can exchange notes about the conditions. If you want me back in Anil, you're not doing a very good job of convincing me. Do I need to convince you? You failed to protect the princess, and that has created the possibility of war. The assassin who was warming your bed now wants nothing more than to spill your innards on the ground. What's left for you here except more shame? Cale slammed his hands on the table, rattling the dishes. Enough. He didn't want his father knowing anything about Selena, or about the remaining fragments of his heart. He wouldn't let his servants change the sheets on his bed because they still smelled like her. Because he went to sleep dreaming that she was still lying beside him. Yo! Oh my god! Hold on. Oh my god! I'm gonna cry. Oh my god! No, because it's like she's really dead for him. Now I'm crying because of Kale. God damn it. I've worked for 10 years to be in this position, and it'll take far more than a few taunts from you to get me back to Anil. And if you think Taryn is weak, then send him to me for training. Maybe here he'll learn how real men act. Oh. Kale shoved his chair away from the table, rattling the dishes again, and stormed to the door. 5 minutes. He'd lasted less than 5 minutes. He paused in the doorway and looked back at his father. The man was smiling faintly at him, still taking him in, still assessing how useful he would be. You talk to her. You so much as look in her direction, Kale warned. And father or not, I'll make you wish you'd never set foot in this castle. And though he didn't wait to hear what his father had to say, Kale left with a sinking feeling that he'd somehow just stepped right into his father's snare. Emotionally, I'm done for today. I'm so sad. Everything is just... It's just gone to shit. How did we get here? I hate how she does this. She had me not on top of the world. I'm not going to say I was on top of the world with Kale, but I was very happy with where I was. And now we're back in the slums. We're back in the slums, and we're back to everyone losing everything and everyone being miserable and people dying, and it's just... He'll be screaming at the end of this in a good way. I hope in a good way. I don't want anything... No more sad things to happen until whatever books y'all are saying made y'all cry. Like, the next books better be so damn happy that I'm just... It makes me forget everything. I'm just so sad. So sad. Love y'all too. It's just... I feel so bad for everyone. It like literally hurts my heart. Poor Kale. Honestly, I felt bad for Kale. I did. But then... Air of Fire. What about Kingdom of Ash? Kingdom of the Ash? Kingdom of Ashes? Something like that. KOA. KOA. What about that one? Is that the last book in the series? Kingdom of Ash? Is that the name of the book? I think that's the name of it. It's fine. It'll be fine. Yeah, it'll be fine. Won't be fine. It's just a book. It's just a book series. It's alright. This is... Alright. Well... The witches are coming. I was... literally, I've been dying for the witches to come in. I've been dying. And my favorite boy... What do you mean your favorite boy? Your favorite boy is Sam. Sam comes back? No, I'm just kidding. I know he doesn't come back. He's dead. Wait, what favorite boy? I thought Sam was your favorite boy. Favorite boy, like love interest for Selena? Is that Rowan? He's a boy. Is it Rowan? I know about Rowan, y'all. Oh, the Fae come back? Is this when Reese comes in? Does Reese come in this book series? Or Sam was the fave boy until later? Hopefully he doesn't do any dumb shit. He's Abraxas. What the is that his name? Oh, that boy. Is that his name? Abraxas? Or is that what he is? That's his name. Abraxas. Reese. Yeah. Okay, so... I feel like I remember... Whenever I was reading A Court of Thorns and Roses, one of the books, I don't know which one, he's a wyvern, and his name is Abraxas. Oh my god, Lexi! You haven't been in any of my lives in so long! How are you? Just don't worry about it, okay? Oh, I need something happy to happen. I need like a pick-me-up, because right now I know I missed you too, but I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you're doing good. No more spoilers. Okay, yeah, no. All right, that's it for today. That's enough questions from me. I don't have any theories. I'm just really sad. I hate how she literally cannot win. Like, literally what she said, that it's the same story over and over. And it's never ending for her. Which, obviously, I know it gets better, but, like, right now, it really sucks. So, yeah, I can't wait for her to be happy. And she could literally, like, just... Because right now, I feel like I'm picturing her as Aelin. I feel like she's Aelin and doesn't know it. Because who else survived in Terrasen after they got, like, blew up? And of course she would be a queen. Like, of course she would. B needs a little excitement to continue. These are... Oh, yeah. Where are you at? Oh, we just finished. I'm on Crown of Midnight, and I just finished chapter 36, so I'm on chapter 37. Nehemiah is dead. She's gone. Selena is in the slums, mentally, emotionally, physically. Yeah, she killed Grave. Kale confessed that he has not let anyone change his bed sheets since the last time she slept in there, because he wants to keep her scent on them. And that did me in for today. That was the final straw for today, because that did me in. I am so sad for everyone. I just want to go in this book and give everyone a hug, because they're going through it. Dorian is over here fearing for his life because he's scared that his father is literally going to have him strung up by his toes and drained of blood. And it's just rough right now. But I keep getting promised that it gets better, and I'm waiting for it to get better, because every time it gets better, we go right back to shit. So who knows? Oh God. All right, well, that's enough. That's enough of me ranting about being sad for today. Tomorrow's Friday, so no live tomorrow. But I will go live on Saturday and Sunday. Yes. I might start having to pull back lives a little bit, because my boss is an author, and she writes, she's a technical writer. She writes, like, curriculum for schools, and she has asked me to write creative books, like stories, because she can't write creatively. So she's asked me to write creatively children's books to go with her curriculum. So I'm gonna be super busy. I have to write like 2 books a week, and not like starting now, like, but I have to write, the curriculum is based on weeks, so I have to write 2 books for 1 week, and then when that is getting revised by editors, I have to write 2 books for another week, and then continuing on. But I'm really nervous about it, because obviously I've never written a book before, and I've written things before, but I'm really nervous to put stuff out there, but I want money, so so yeah, if I end up having to like miss a live, or like not schedule a live for a day, that's probably why. But I will try to work around my schedule that I have now to make sure that I don't miss lives with y'all, because I love this so much. Thank you. I really am really nervous about it, and my boss is she's not mean, but she is very critical. So yeah, she told me that I'm not writing stories, I'm just teaching. So but I'm telling a story to teach, basically, is what I'm gonna be doing. So I do that every day at work anyway, so I feel like it should be easy, but who knows. Anyway, just wanted to let y'all know. But yeah, I will see you guys on Saturday still. We're set for Saturday still. And Tell Them from Blood and Ash. Yeah, I read the group chat messages and I was literally cackling. Only 20 chapters left to finish. I don't want to finish this book. I don't want to move on and get to the sadder books because I can't handle it. Anyway, yeah. I love y'all. I will see y'all Saturday. Have a nice night or morning or afternoon, depending on wherever you are. And yeah, I'll see y'all Saturday.